an American soldier in Iraq found a photograph inside an abandoned building, and every face in that photograph was someone from his unit, but the photograph was dated 3 years before any of them had ever set foot in Iraq. This is not a story about combat. This is a story about something that had no explanation, something that stayed with every man in that unit long after they came home, and something that the official report never mentioned. It was the summer of 2006. The temperature in the Al Anbar province had been sitting above 110 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 consecutive weeks. Specialist Daniel Reeves, 24 years old from Dayton, Ohio, had been in Iraq for 7 months. He was not the kind of soldier who talked much. He kept a small notebook in his left chest pocket and wrote in it every night before he slept, not about the mission, not about the heat, but about ordinary things. The kind of man who noticed details, and that quality is what made what happened on the afternoon of July the 9th, 2006 so impossible to set aside. The patrol that day had taken Reeves and 5 other members of his unit into a stretch of territory on the western edge of Ramadi that had been officially marked as cleared. Sergeant Marcus Webb, 31 years old, from Knoxville, Tennessee, was leading the patrol. Webb moved slowly and spoke quietly. He had a habit of pausing at doorways before entering, not out of fear, but out of something closer to a private acknowledgement that these had been someone's home. The building they entered at approximately 3:40 in the afternoon was a 2-story structure on the corner of an unnamed road. Reeves and Private First Class Aaron Cole, 22 years old, from Boise, Idaho, made their way up a narrow staircase to the 2nd floor. The 2nd floor had 3 rooms. The first 2 were empty. The 3rd room was at the end of a short hallway. The door was partially open. Reeves pushed it the rest of the way. The room was small. A single window on the far wall was shuttered, and the light that came through the gaps fell in thin, straight lines across the floor. In the corner directly beneath the window there was a wooden box. It was not locked. It was not hidden. It was simply sitting there in the corner of an empty room in an abandoned building in a part of Ramadi that no one had occupied for months. Reeves opened the box. Inside there was folded cloth, a few old coins, a small ceramic figure wrapped carefully, and beneath all of that, at the very bottom, there was a photograph. The photograph was printed on standard photographic paper. The colors had faded slightly, the way photographs do when stored in heat for a long period. Reeves picked it up and turned it over, and then he stopped. The photograph showed a group of men standing in front of a building. Every face in that photograph was a face he saw every single day. Sergeant Webb was on the left. Private First Class Cole was in the center. Corporal James Hadley from Sacramento, California, stood with his arms crossed the way he always stood. Private Luis Ortega from El Paso, Texas, squinted slightly into the light. Specialist Karen Merritt from Portland, Oregon, stood near the center, and at the far right, standing slightly apart from the others, was a figure that Reeves recognized as himself. He stood in that room for what he later described as a very long time. He turned the photograph. Over the back had a date stamped in small, neat typeface. The date read September 2003. Reeves had enlisted in January 2004. He had arrived in Iraq in December 2005. In September 2003, he had been a 21-year-old working at an automotive parts store in Dayton, Ohio. He had never been to Iraq. He had never met any of the people in his unit. In September 2003, none of them had yet been assigned together. Some had not yet enlisted. Cole was the first person. Reeves showed it to Cole, looked at it for a long time without speaking, then said he did not understand what he was looking at. They brought it downstairs and showed it to Sergeant Webb. Webb examined it carefully, asked where exactly in the room Reeves had found it, looked at the date for a long time, and then looked at the photograph again. He did not say anything for several minutes that evening. Every member of the unit confirmed what Reeves had first observed. Every face was one of theirs. The image was clear enough that there was no question of misidentification. These were not people who resembled them. These were them. The building visible in the Background became the next question. No one in the unit recognized it. Intelligence personnel at the base examined the image and concluded it appeared to be somewhere in the Al Anbar province based on architectural details, but they could not identify the specific location. The area around the abandoned building was re-examined. The wooden box was taken for further analysis. No fingerprints were recovered from the photograph itself. In the weeks that followed, several members of the unit attempted to identify the building. They requested aerial imagery. They cross-referenced architectural details with known structures in the region. They did not find a match. The building in the background was never identified. The photograph was submitted as part of a routine report. The report noted that an unidentified photograph had been recovered during a patrol. The resemblance between the individuals depicted and members of the unit was noted. The report offered no explanation because no explanation was available. It was filed, and it remained filed. Sergeant Webb spoke about the photograph only once in any detail. In an interview conducted years after he returned, he said what stayed with him was the expression on the face of the figure he recognized as himself. The figure was not smiling. The figure was looking directly into the camera with an expression that Webb described as knowing, an expression that suggested the figure understood something that the men standing around him did not. Reeves kept a copy of the photograph. He did not display it. He kept it in an envelope inside a larger envelope at the back of a drawer. He said in the years after his return that he had made a kind of peace with not understanding it. He said that some things that happen are not waiting for an explanation. They have already happened, and no amount of examination changes that. The photograph, he said, was one of those things. What happened in that room on July the 9th, 2006 was never resolved. The photograph was never explained. The building in the background was never identified. The date on the back was never accounted for. What remained was only what Reeves had carried out of that room, a single image of 6 people standing in front of a building that no one could find, taken at a time when none of those 6 people had ever met. There are events in the course of a war that find their way into records, and there are events that do not fit inside any record. This was one of the second kind. It did not fit, it simply existed, and the men and women in that photograph each carried it with them in their own way. None of them ever claimed to understand it. They only agreed that the photograph had been real, that they had all held it, and that the date on the back had said what it said. Some questions are simply the shape of something that happened. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with the people who lived it, then you are exactly who this channel is. For every week we bring accounts like this one, stories from the years of the Iraq War that never made it into the official record, stories about what soldiers encountered in the space between what was documented and what was actually experienced. If you want to hear more, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next, because the next story involves 3 soldiers who each reported the same encounter independently, and none of them knew the others had reported it, and their accounts were identical in every single detail.